China has no aircraft carriers in the Mediterranean, no troops in the Horn of Africa, no missiles in the Strait of Malacca, and yet, right now, it controls more strategic maritime territory than any nation since the British Empire. No war, no invasion, no threat, just concrete debt and patience. This is what power looks like when it stops announcing itself. And the ports it is building, in countries most people cannot find on a map, are not about trade. They never were. Most people carry a version of the world in their heads where the oceans are neutral, where ships move freely because international law says they should, where the rules of global trade apply equally to everyone, and no single nation can quietly tip the board in its favor without someone sounding an alarm. That version of the world is a comfortable fiction. The real world runs on choke points, narrow strips of water with the volume of human civilization. Its oil, its electronics, its food, its medicine squeezes through corridors so tight that a single hostile navy could, in theory, bring entire economies to their knees within weeks. The Strait of Malacca, the Bab el-Mandeb, the Strait of Hormuz, the Suez Canal. Most people could not point to these places on a map, but every object in the room around you passed through at least one of them. China knows exactly where they are, and for the past 12 years, it has been building something at every single one of them. The story begins earlier than most people realize. Not in 2013, when Xi Jinping stood in Astana, Kazakhstan, and announced a Belt and Road Initiative to a politely confused audience of Central Asian dignitaries. It begins in 2003, in a speech that the Chinese government has since tried very hard to make difficult to find. President Hu Jintao stood before his senior military commanders and named what he called China's most dangerous strategic vulnerability. He called it the Malacca Dilemma. The problem was this. 80% of China's oil imports travel through a single strait, the Strait of Malacca, a strip of water between Malaysia and Indonesia that narrows at one point to just 2.7 kilometers across. The United States Navy patrolled it. In any serious military confrontation, Washington could block it. China's economy would begin suffocating within days. Hu Jintao did not announce a war. He announced an infrastructure program. What followed was the most methodical geographic repositioning of power since the age of European colonialism, and it was done so slowly, so incrementally, and so dressed in the language of development and cooperation that most of the world spent a decade arguing about whether it was really happening at all. It is worth pausing to understand the instrument China chose. It did not choose its military, at least not openly. It chose its banks and its shipping companies. Chiefly the Export-Import Bank of China, the China Development Bank, and a state-owned shipping giant called China COSCO Shipping, the third largest shipping company on Earth. These institutions moved quietly into developing nations carrying something those nations desperately wanted, capital. No lectures about governance. No conditions about democratic reform. Just money, engineers, and a contract. The contracts had a pattern. China would finance a port. A Chinese state company would build it. The host country would repay the loan over time, with the port itself as collateral. It was a clean arrangement. And in country after country, it worked exactly as China needed it to. When the loans could not be repaid, and China's own internal documents suggest as analysts knew, in many cases, that they could not be repaid, the collateral was claimed. The case that crystallized this for the rest of the world was Hambantota. Sri Lanka in the mid-2000s was a country hungry for development and short on options. China offered to finance a deep-water port on the country's southern coast. The location was, on the surface, puzzling. Hambantota was not a major commercial hub. It had no natural hinterland to speak of. Western development banks passed on it. China did not pass. The port was built. The loans accumulated. The interest compounded. By 2017, Sri Lanka's government, facing a debt it could not service, signed over a 99-year lease on Hambantota port to a Chinese state company. 99 years. For the price of a loan Sri Lanka should never have taken, China acquired a deep-water port sitting directly astride the Indian Ocean shipping lane between the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Malacca, a port capable of hosting commercial vessels, a port that, with modest modification, could host naval vessels, a port that will still be under Chinese control in 2116. The British, a century and a half earlier, had used the same lease structure to take Hong Kong. Hambantota was not the exception. It was the template. In Pakistan, China poured $62 billion into the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, a network of roads, pipelines, and infrastructure connecting China's western province of Xinjiang directly to the port of Gwadar on the Arabian Sea. Gwadar sits at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. It gives China a land corridor to the ocean that bypasses the Strait of Malacca entirely. The distance Chinese goods must travel to reach energy markets drops by 12,000 kilometers. In Djibouti, a country the size of a mid-sized American city, wedged between Somalia, Eritrea, and Ethiopia, China opened its first officially acknowledged overseas military base in 2017. Djibouti controls the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, through which 10% of global oil trade passes every single day. The base sits alongside American, French, Japanese, and Italian military installations. China did not displace anyone. It simply moved in next door. In Myanmar, China financed the port Kyaukpyu on the Bay of Bengal, another bypass route around Malacca, with pipelines running directly into China's Yunnan province. And then there is the one that most people in the West still have not fully absorbed. In 2016, China COSCO Shipping purchased a controlling stake in Port of Piraeus in Greece for 368 million euros. Piraeus is the largest port in the Mediterranean. It is the primary maritime gateway into the European Union from Asia. Since the acquisition, it has become the fastest-growing port in Europe, its container volume more than tripling under Chinese management. It is inside the European Union. China now sits at the front door of the world's largest single market and collects a toll, not in cash, but in data, in logistics control, in the ability to prioritize or delay cargo at will. When Greece was brought into the Belt and Road Initiative in 2019, it became the first EU member state to formally join. The following year, Greece blocked an EU statement criticizing China's human rights record. These things are related. Now consider the cranes. Across the world's major ports, the cranes that load and unload container ships are overwhelmingly manufactured by a single Chinese company called ZPMC, Genoa Port Machinery Company. ZPMC holds approximately 70% of the global crane market. Its machines stand in ports across the United States, Europe, Asia, and Africa. They run on Chinese software. They are networked. In 2023, the U.S. Navy and FBI conducted a review of Chinese-manufactured cranes at American military ports and found communications equipment with no clear commercial purpose. China did not need to place spies in ports. It built the infrastructure of the ports themselves. Here is where the story turns. Everything described so far has been framed, in most Western media, as Chinese aggression, Chinese expansionism, a rising authoritarian power using debt and infrastructure to coerce smaller nations and challenge the liberal international order. That framing is not wrong, but it is incomplete in a way that should make Western governments deeply uncomfortable. The strategy China is executing, infrastructure as geopolitical leverage, ports as power projection, logistics networks as a shadow military capability, is not a Chinese invention. It is an American one. After World War II, the United States built the most extensive overseas basing network in human history. Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, Guam in the Pacific, Bahrain in the Gulf, Okinawa off the coast of China, dozens of ports, airfields, and refueling stations across every ocean on Earth. The explicit purpose was to ensure that American military and commercial power could reach any point on the globe within days. It worked. For 70 years, it was a foundation of what strategists called Pax Americana, American peace, maintained by American presence, enforced by American logistics. China studied that system. Its strategists wrote about it, analyzed it, and concluded that the only way to match it was not to build a bigger navy, not yet, but to quietly position assets at the critical nodes of the global logistics network before anyone could object. The United States taught the world that ports were power. China was paying attention. And while China was building, the United States was retreating, not intentionally, not by policy, but by the accumulated weight of decades of decisions that prioritize financial returns over physical infrastructure. Today, the United States has no ports in the global top 10 by container volume. The Port of Los Angeles, the busiest in America, ranks roughly 17th in the world. Shanghai alone handles more container traffic than all American ports combined. China built its way to the center of the global logistics system using capital it accumulated by exporting goods through markets the United States opened in the belief that trade would make China more like the West. Hambantota, Gwadar, Djibouti, Piraeus, Kyaukpyu, Chokepoints in Peru, where China opened a massive new Pacific port in late 2024, the first major Chinese-controlled port in South America, giving Beijing a staging point on the western edge of the hemisphere that the United States has considered its strategic backyard for 200 years. These are not dots on a development map. They are nodes in a network built not to move goods efficiently, though it does that too, built to ensure that in a crisis, a blockade, a confrontation, a war over Taiwan, China has options, multiple corridors, multiple alternatives, multiple points of presence that the United States Navy would have to neutralize simultaneously before it could constrain Chinese logistics. That is what $1 trillion buys when you spend on the right things. Not tanks, not missiles, ports in countries nobody can find on a map. The British Empire understood something that the modern world forgot, and China quietly remembered. You do not need to conquer territory to control it. You need to be indispensable to it. You need to be the entity that built the road, laid the cable, dredged the harbor. You need to be the infrastructure. China is the infrastructure now, in more places for more nations than any other power on earth. And the nations that welcome Chinese money are now navigating reality in which saying no to Beijing carries costs that nobody fully priced into the original contract. The port of Hambantota will still be Chinese in 2116. The cranes at Piraeus will still run on Chinese software. Gwadar will still connect China's interior to the Arabian Sea. The question that no one in Washington, Brussels, or Delhi has answered convincingly is this: what exactly is the plan to reverse any of it? Because China did not build these ports to be temporary. It built them to be permanent. And permanence in geopolitics is the only currency that actually matters.